Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Blue Horizon seminar of the Center for Blue Governance. My name is Miali Anjiama Fazafi. I will be chairing this session. So this seminar will be recorded. If in case you'd rather to not appear in this seminar, maybe you can just turn off your camera so you won't appear. So as I said earlier, my name is Dr. Miali Anjiama Fazafi. I'm actually a former research fellow at the Center for Blue Governance. I'm very happy to be here. I'm currently based at the University of Geneva, but I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. So as we know, the blue economy is everywhere now, and it's also a very trendy topic. And I think it's one of the rare seminars here that I've attended that we try to bring different approach in relation to the blue economy. And today what we'd like to talk about is climate change and also various perspectives around that. So for this seminar, the aim is really to understand a nuanced perspective from adaptation and mitigation to climate change within the blue economy. So for that, we have a range of wonderful speakers that will give different multidisciplinary perspective. And also they will talk about the research, and we will also have a discussion about what it is to do research in this sphere of climate change and the blue economy. So I will introduce them so you know who they are. We will start with Alicia Engeta. If you can raise your hand. Alicia is a PhD candidate at London University at the Center for Sustainability Studies. She will present to us today some facts about climate change and also trends in fisheries and the ocean to set the scene in this discussion that we will have today. And then we will have also a presentation from Krishni Apadu, who is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Mauritius, but also a PhD candidate at the Western Australia University. And Mrs. Apado will talk to us about climate change and law from the perspective of small island developing states. And then we will have Tanya Duba. Where is she? She is there. Yes, here she is. Tanya is a PhD candidate from the University of Cape Town. And also part of the South African Environmental Observation Network. So what Tanya will bring us today will be presentation about the climate risk perception by small-scale fishers and what does that implies in the blue economy. And finally, we will have Samia Salim, that is a professor, but also the director of the Center for Sustainability Studies at the University of Liberal Arts in Bangladesh. And Samia will talk to us about adaptation to climate change within coastal community. We were also supposed to have another speaker, which is Barka Mosae. Unfortunately, she was not available for my last minute, so we apologize for that. But I think we already have a very good range of speakers that will provide us a very diverse perspective about climate change, mitigation, and adaptation within blue economy communities. So we will have mostly perspective from island state, but also from big countries like Bangladesh. So I think I will give straight away the floor to Alicia. So what we will do is we will have 4 presentations. After maybe the best would be that you keep your question for or I can say that maybe we can take clarification question after each presentation. I will moderate that. 1 or 2 clarification question if you have. Otherwise, we can have a discussion after the 4 presentation. So straight away, Alicia, I'll give the floor to you to set the scene of this conversation that we will have.
Thank you, Miali. I will I have a PowerPoint, so I will just put it. Okay, so today my talk will be about setting the scene, and I will do it through the angle of my research. So I will be talking about climate change small-scale fisheries and loss and damage, and precisely why diverse perspectives matter. I will start with this quote that I personally appreciate, which is a quote from Livingstone about the fact that climate inhabits different worlds. And precisely, we are here today from everywhere in the world, and I'm pretty sure our experience, how we feel climate change, and also how we are vulnerable to it is quite different. And how can we know that is often when we ask people, what are you impacted? And they will reflect on it based on what they value the most. And it's something that is very situated and located. And fisher have developed a specific relationship with the ocean and specific knowledge also and value. And we also have different elements that can also shape how we feel and experience climate change, which can be from cultural norms in our context, from socioeconomic reality, or also political context, for instance. We must also acknowledge as a practitioner that our discipline, the method we use, will also affect how we inform about climate change, and therefore how we contribute to policy and action in regard to climate change. So today we will see different perspectives through the speakers that we have and that have been presented. Just a brief overview about the trend in tropical fisheries. So from the scenario, tropical area, which will be the main focus of today, are in regard to fisheries, the most impacted and will be the most impacted in the future by climate change. And in this part of the world, if I can say, we have many small-scale fisheries, but especially artisanal fishery, which is often not just a way to earn an income, but is also a way of life, and it's tied to people's well-being. So there is this need to have approaches that really, if I can say, integrate the view of people in order to tackle climate change and precisely to avoid loss and damage. So what is loss and damage? We don't have a clear definition, but we refer to it as when adaptation, mitigation, and risk management fails to deliver against climate change. So for instance, for mitigation, we still haven't decreased the emission how we should have. And also sometimes we can have some carbon storage initiatives that does not consider biodiversity. For adaptations, there is a lot of reports, whether scientific or more practitioners, that highlight how some initiative on the ground have actually led to maladaptation or increased further vulnerability because there was no consideration of the context. And in terms of risk, there is always a residual risk remaining, which means that we are always at risk of having actually loss and damage. And so I think the key question from all of this field, if I can say, of climate change is to ask yourself what is considered, for instance, successful in regard to adaptation for who, why, and where. And this is particularly important in regard to the field where I am, which is the field of loss and damage. So in regard to science, we say that we are focusing on the measurement of loss of who experiences everyday loss from climate change. And we have basically emphasizing that to know what is loss and damage is about to know what people value. And there are two types of loss and damage. They can be economic. So if I use the fishery context, that will be, for instance, the loss of a boat or nets. And here we can add some monetary valuation. But they can also be non-economic. And these ones are more what we say are not tradable in the market. For instance, because of climate change, we can lose our identity, or traditional knowledge, or life, or even biodiversity, which is personally what I'm looking in my research and how it leads to other type of loss and damage. So this is basically whether we are looking at extreme or slow onset event of climate change. And it's important to emphasize that because it's key to have sustainable ocean for all that is inclusive and equitable, and also to sustain fisheries. We already have some example of loss and damage that are projected with the Tuvalu. First, I'm just briefly mentioning, so they have this future project where they aim to digitalize a nation. So people in future generation will be able to know what is the culture of Tuvaluan, what was it, and still be connected to that. And also they will have a government that will be in this platform and so on. So basically the key question with this example, but also it's always how do we determine things people value? Can we value also everything? And in fishery, we have from currently, but it's starting to shift, but since it's an economic sector, valuation were mainly made economically. And we need to keep in mind this is a sector, the ocean is vast, so there are multiple value sector, knowledge, competing in this sphere. So how also to ensure that different perspectives are all integrated in everything we do. So that is also some of the key challenges. And I will finish my last slide actually with a quote from my case study site, which is Martinique. So it's a French region located in the Caribbean. So this quote is from a fisher, and I think it emphasizes also the need to also analyze climate change from the everyday life of people, because many aspects intersect daily to shape how we live and experience climate change, as I was saying in the introduction. So what this fisher was saying is that climate change is here for sure. We don't know what fish we will get and when. Every day is unpredictable. We are used to this change, but in several years it has increased. And every day we have administrative rules that add additional pressure on us. We have to follow this rule while dealing with the sargassum. So this is a toxic algae. The chlordecone, it is a pesticide that we have sprayed in the banana, and now we have fishery ban in especially the Atlantic part of the island, but also the Caribbean part. And it also say, basically, we also, on top of that, need to reflect on where and what we can or not fish, the climate and our personal life. We have to fight to remain who we are, fisher folks, before old. So today, basically, I would like you to have this multiple view of climate change that we will have and see in different contexts. And yeah, I will now leave the floor to Other, and this is a project I'm part with, and I'm looking forward to have discussion later.
Thank you very much, Alicia. This was very interesting, and obviously the fisheries is one of the big pillar of the blue economy. So I think we will have someone else that will talk about that. But I think it's important to set the scene of what climate change means for the coastal communities and the fishers that are have different perspective on this. So do we have any clarification question for Alicia? So now I will give the floor to Krishni Apadu. She's from the University of Mauritius, and she will talk to us about climate change, but this time from a legal perspective, from the disciplinary law, and also from the perspective of small island developing states. So Krishni, I give you the floor.
So thank you very much to the organizers, especially to Miali and to Alicia for setting up this, transdisciplinary webinar on climate change and especially related to fisheries. I think I was going to talk mainly about loss and damage, but Alicia has already introduced the topic, so I won't be, going too much into loss and damage. So there are three aspects of, the law that I will be talking about in my presentation. The first one is obviously loss and damage, which has become a really important concept in international climate change law and policy right now. And then I'm also going to touch upon climate change litigation and also the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on states' obligations regarding climate change. So as Alicia has mentioned, what is loss and damage? Loss and damage refers to the negative effects of climate change that occur despite efforts at adaptation and mitigation. So right now, in terms of the law, there has been a big win at the when there was the signing and adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. We have Article 8 that speaks that mentions, and there's a provision regarding loss and damage in the Paris Agreement. It has been enshrined properly in the Paris Agreement, which is the agreement relating to how we're going to reduce our emissions in terms of climate change. So that was a big win, but before that, negotiations regarding loss and damage started even at the beginning of the negotiations for the UNFCCC. So the AOSIS, which is the Alliance of Small Island States and represents a lot of small island developing states, it was the organization that really started canvassing and really started negotiating about the need to bring loss and damage into the picture when there was the negotiation of the UNFCCC. But unfortunately, over there, it took a lot of years, and it was only in 2013 with the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage that we saw really loss and damage becoming, the talk of the town. And then, of course, we had, as I've mentioned, Article 8 of the Paris Agreement. And then there was continuously, there was, through the negotiation process, through international legal processes, there was trying to bring climate change loss and damage to the surface. And what happened is at COP27, at the meeting of the parties of the UNFCCC at COP27, we had finally a decision where it was agreed by all state parties that there would be a fund and funding mechanism relating to loss and damage. So this was a landmark decision. This was a huge win for AOSIS and other developing nations and small island developing states, because that was what we needed. We needed the money. How were we going to combat climate change when adaptation and mitigation efforts were had already been used, and then there were still the effects of loss and damage, especially by states and the developing world. So this was a huge win, and it would also mark the beginning of trying to incorporate the words compensation and liability. Okay, because during when there was the adoption of the Article 8 in the Paris Agreement, there was a strict mention by developed countries, especially by the US, that didn't want to bring the word liability and compensation into the Paris Agreement, because of course it would open the door to a lot of countries coming and using Article 8 and trying to get compensation for loss and damage. So the fund, as I mentioned, was a huge win. And there was, throughout 2023, there was a series of transitional committees that were set up. So there were 5 transitional committees that were set up to come up to bring together developed nations and developing nations, including small island developing states, to find a way of, where would, for example, answering the questions of who would be hosting the fund, who would be the countries that would be donating to the fund, what level of finance would be given, what kind of mechanisms would be in place, for example, to stop corruption if, money is being given to developing states and small island developing states. So there was this series of transitional committees that were set up. And finally, just before COP28 last year, there was an agreement. There was a sort of agreement that came out, although there were a lot of, previously there were a lot of talk about developing and small island developing states not being too happy about the final, the mechanism, how it would work. So now it was decided by a decision at the COP28 that the Loss and Damage Fund would be hosted by the World Bank. But this in itself is something which is very worrying for small island developing states and for developing nations, because we know that most of the funds and most of the power of the World Bank, it comes from the big developed nations and the United States, for example. So this is a little bit about law and policy relating to climate change and what's to loss and damage, and what's the state of affairs relating to loss and damage right now. The second thing that I'm going to talk about very quickly is climate change litigation. So the current global financing for adaptation, as has been mentioned by Alicia, it does not come close to even meeting the current needs that we have. This constrains the implementation of adaptation options, especially for small island developing states. And as climate-related damages mount, there is the quest for a just resolution for, the urgent, trying to find urgent solutions for small island developing states. So litigation is emerging as a potent tool, with climate justice increasingly finding its voice in courts across the world. So people, communities, and nations are turning to the law to urge governments and the corporate sector to take responsibility for their actions, for their emissions. So there is rather, as we see the development of climate change and loss and damage litigation, there is rather a timid attempt in SIDS to resort to climate change litigation, because it is more, if you look at the through the lens of climate change litigation, it is mostly countries in the developed world that have turned to climate change litigation. So as SIDS, we are still learning about the potential of climate change litigation. I give you one example. For example, in Mauritius, there is the Environmental and Land Use Appeal Tribunal, which is the court which is responsible for environmental matters in the country. And we are having now a case that has been brought at the highest level, at the Privy Council level, because the Privy Council is our highest court in Mauritius. And there was a judgment by the Supreme Court which gave, locus standi, which allowed NGOs to bring cases relating to the environment, relating to the climate in front of the tribunal in Mauritius. But what happened is the government of Mauritius was not happy with the decision that the Supreme Court gave locus standi, gave standing to NGOs to represent the public in terms of matters relating to climate change and the environment. And therefore, the government appealed that decision in front of the Privy Council. So what we are fearing in small island developing states is that governments would try to bring a blockade, would try not to encourage NGOs, especially representing people's rights, to bring matters relating to climate change in front of the highest court of the countries of SIDS. So the final thing that, if I'm still in time, the final thing that I will be talking about is the ICJ advisory opinion. So do countries have an obligation to protect our climate for the well-being of people living today? What about the well-being of the next generation if we are thinking about intra and intergenerational equity? If countries harm the climate system and vulnerable states like SIDS, what might be the legal consequences under international law? So these are the questions that the UN General Assembly has posed to the International Court of Justice, which is the principal judicial organ of the UN, in a recent request for an advisory opinion. If the ICJ responds in the affirmative for the question of countries harming the climate change system and vulnerable states like SIDS, then developed nations might bear legal consequences under international law and lead to a barrage of climate change litigation by developing and small island developing states. So while the ICJ's advisory opinion in international law, it is not legally binding, but they can clarify rights and obligations of states under existing binding international law, such as the Paris Agreement in this case, and as such carry significant legal weight and authority. The court's ruling would thus provide a clear legal benchmark and remove any ambiguity surrounding especially developed and developed countries' obligations for small island developing states and developing countries under international law for climate change. So the idea of bringing climate change cases before the ICJ is not something new. It was considered by the small island developing state of Tuvalu back in 2002 against the US and Australia. In 2011, having gathered support of more than 30 like-minded countries, another small island developing state, the country of Palau, led an attempt to have the United Nations General Assembly request an ICJ opinion to clarify the legal responsibility of the largest emitters with respect to climate change, and this was unfortunately met with pushback by the US. In conclusion, in 2023, again, having shored up its case with scientific evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC, and secured the backing of more than 130 developing and developed countries, again, the small Pacific island state of Vanuatu. So you can see how small island developing states really care about the climate, and they are the ones that are bearing the brunt of climate change. So they are trying as much as they can to bring climate change to the forefront and to the forefront of the International Court of Justice. So the small Pacific island state of Vanuatu spearheaded a United Nations General Assembly resolution requesting the ICJ for an advisory opinion clarifying countries' obligations under international law to protect the climate system from anthropogenic climate emissions for states and for present and future generations. So I think this is the three aspects that I wanted to present: the loss and damage, climate change litigation, and the ICJ advisory opinion from a legal perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Krishni. This is very interesting, and it gives us really interesting legal perspective on what's going on now, especially for that. I think we've always known that small island developing states are leader in different fields, in either in the blue economy or in climate change. But I think to hear it from the legal perspective is good. It would be also interesting to hear from our audience later if they know of our experience of climate litigation that could be similar or that they've seen in their field. So I think that's a very good. Thank you very much. I think we will continue with Tanya. Tanya Juba, who is from the University of Cape Town. And now we will move from the legal aspect to the small-scale fishers and their perspective about perception about climate risks. So Tanya, I give you 10 minutes. Thank you.
So much, Maggie and Alicia, our host, for having us, and thank you for the beautiful presentation you gave just now, Krishna. So I'm going to talk about the work that I'm doing in South Africa with the small-scale fishing communities along the east coast of South Africa, which is a very remote area. It's rural areas. It's in the poorest province in South Africa. And I think maybe it's important for me to just start by saying it's no longer a question whether or not climate change is happening. I think we all now know that climate change is happening. But the question now is, how do we respond to it? And our response to climate change should be inclusive, it should be participatory, it should be responsive to the needs and the perspective of people who are vulnerable, to the impacts of climate change. And so my work looks at climate risk perceptions in coastal communities and the fishing communities along the east coast of South Africa. And obviously, just in that space, there's a lot of stakeholders. There's the fishers themselves, there's the resource managers, there's the climate scientists, there's different stakeholders that are in that space that are part of the small scale fishing communities, and they inform policy in South Africa. So what's important about climate risk perception is that it's an important determinant of a successful or effectiveness climate change initiatives, because if you think about people's willingness to take action to climate change, then you must think about whether or not they think that they are at risk to begin with. So part of my work then was to look at those risk perception from the different stakeholders in small-scale fisheries, not just looking at the fishermen only, but people who mostly inform policy in South Africa, which is usually the scientific researchers, as well as the policymakers themselves. So I brought this group of people together in a workshop called the Participatory Scenario Planning Process, which is really a platform for people to exchange knowledge, think about the future, what they think it's going to look like, and plan for it. And in that workshop already, you could tell that the way in which people think about risk is different, the different stakeholders. So from the scientific research community, risk is more defined in terms of hazard. So when they talk about risk, they talk about rainfall, maybe you get an extreme event of like a flooding, and when they explain it, they talk about above normal or normal rainfall or below normal. But when you talk to the local community members, when they think about risk, they think in terms of impact and not a hazard. So already those differences, they make it difficult for people to have conversations around what really is a risk and what is it that people need to plan for. So that's what I picked up from that a workshop that we had, is that there's those differences. And then we all know that now indigenous knowledge is starting to come up and being seen for its value in policy formation. And it wasn't the case back in the day. It was only, the scientific researchers that would inform policy, but now we see more indigenous knowledge being, coming into the space. Those the local communities being invited in dialogues where they get to inform how to adapt in climate change. So it was quite interesting to see those differences and to see the relationship, between the two, between the scientific researchers and the fishers themselves, because there was an instance where before we could even meet, just preparing for the workshop, that people felt, well, the local communities, they felt that they could not trust the scientists because the scientists are coming into their community to just pick up a sample of water and then go into the lab and analyze that and come and tell them what to do. Whereas they live there with the changing conditions, the climate conditions, with the changing environment, they are there every day. They felt that they know better than the scientists, so they can't be told what to do by someone who comes in once in a while to pick up a sample and then goes back to inform policy. So even those like nuances, like those little conflicts between the stakeholders were quite important in making sure that, climate change adaptation and mitigation plans are made from a place of common understanding and not just from a scientific point of view or only from local indigenous knowledge, because people who are adapted, who live in coastal areas, are adapted to those changes. They know how to cope with it already, but they could benefit from the kind of information that scientific researchers produce, because it's much broader in scale. The local people know what is happening in their local area, and the scientific researchers will know what's happening in the whole region. So an exchange of such information is not a better idea. It's in fact beneficial for both parties to understand the context or the local priorities in different communities, so that no one is undermined in the planning or the development of adaptation strategies. So I think above all, that's like the most important thing that I would like to bring up and discuss more in the discussion slot that we have, is the fact that respecting the different perceptions and perspectives of people in the space in coming up with climate change adaptation is important, because then the effectiveness of the climate change adaptation strategy is not undermined. The equity and the sustainability of those adaptation actions and policies are much more firm and strong, because people's opinions or people's perceptions and perspectives on how they have experienced climate change or how they've observed climate change are being taken into consideration, and together these different kinds of knowledge can co-produce knowledge that will inform policy. So yeah, I think I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That was very, very good as well. And I really like this. I think they will have quite a good bunch of scientists on the call, and I really like that you brought that very well-known challenge of divide between researchers and local communities and fishers, including and those questions of things like parachute science. So I think this is something that we could discuss in a few minutes, actually. But before that, there is a question for you. You can respond to that in the chat already. But maybe in between that, we can leave the time for Samia to do a presentation so that we can have a bigger discussion after. So Samia will talk to us about adaptation to climate change, but also perspective from coastal communities in Bangladesh. So the floor is yours, Samia.
Great. Thank you, Melly and Alicia. And thanks for having me as part of this, really diverse panel. It's been great listening to my previous speakers. So yeah, so I'm a marine social scientist, and I've been working in Bangladesh the last 8 years now, on a diverse different research projects on sustainability and climate change, but specifically along the coast, a lot on climate adaptation, building resilience in communities, and now kind of tying in with the, now that we're reaching adaptation limits and moving more into the loss and damage space. I've also been working a lot on equity and justice, and identifying those adaptation limits, and how do we get more participatory, more people involved in trying to bring out these issues from adaptation to now loss and damage space in the coastal belt as well. So the community that I primarily work with are mostly small-scale fishers. So from southwest in Bangladesh, it's the Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world. So I work with communities there, a lot of small-scale fishers, smallholder farmers, women, indigenous communities, and other marginalized groups. And then on the southeast, there's a lot of development with blue economy. There's a lot of development taking place. So you have this both navigating that space of impact of climate change alongside with a lot of anthropogenic activities and disturbances and such. So how do we understand these adaptation and move from how communities are coping to adapting, but how do we truly try and bring transformative adaptation, where they're not just like bouncing back to a state there where, when we talk about resilience, we talk about, about absorbing the shocks and the stressors and bouncing back to a previous state. But here, as we're saying, as with extreme, more frequent storms and cyclones with slow onset stressors or salinity, in particular, I'm talking about in Bangladesh, that's some of the climatic impacts we're facing. So to kind of bring these, highlight the key things I want to point out from these issues, I'm just going to share 2 case studies of what I'm working on. So firstly, the first one is in the Sundarbans belt. It's a transboundary project between India, Sundarbans, and Bangladesh. Working with 2 communities on both sides. And again, this was mentioned by Tanya and others as well. It is really key. Alicia mentioned this as well, that to have that very localized, context-specific, and what we're calling in this project very situated adaptive practices. So not just to look at how communities adapting and kind of have a narrative of, things we know, diversified livelihoods, sustainable, pathways, market linkages, and moving away from, say, agricultural fisheries to more other alternative livelihoods because of the pressure, in our natural systems and due to climate change. But we have to take into consideration very much on, how do people perceive not just climate change, what do they want to do about it, maybe. So, and then work with that, where you have the community, the government, local and national academics and researchers. So ours is a very transdisciplinary project. So last 1 year, we've been conducting ethnographic work in both sides. And what I wanted to highlight was on the Bangladesh side, we work in this place, Ashashuni, which due to a severe storm in 2009, Ayla, it was for 2 years, the place was inundated, embankment broke. And so we went there trying to understand this adaptation, how the communities are coping. And what we found was, due to the circumstances, there was created a very strong local governance, that space for socio-ecological local governance, and where the community came together and the local, and other fisheries, forestry people came together, and they wanted to move away from monoculture and aquaculture and things that led to more, and have a more diversified integrated farming practices. And because a lot of the men have moved away, migrating, 2 years they couldn't farm, we're seeing gender transformation in that space, where women, in previously, they were more in the house, the space was more in the home, they couldn't access markets, they weren't necessarily involved in the fishing and farming, but now they are. So we're trying to understand, what are those leverage points that has allowed, stronger local governance, forming clusters of, of smallholding farmers that's allowing them to adapt better, and what can we learn from there that we can, then apply. So it's an ongoing research. And obviously, the other key thing was that knowledge exchange and knowledge mobilization, not researchers or academics teaching them, okay, now this is a better farming practice, but blending that indigenous knowledge that they have alongside with, scientific knowledge to bring about some of those adaptive practices that will, help communities to build resilience within the community. The other case study, that story that I wanted to share, brings me to the southeast in the Matarbari, Mohashkali, where I work. It's again a hotspot for a lot of blue economy developments happening there. There's a deep sea port. There's liquid natural gas terminals. So there's been obviously a lot of growth, and the narrative is, it'll provide more jobs and livelihoods and help, people, fishermen who, besides this work on the blue economy, we're also working with fishermen there on how they're perceiving the extreme weather, how they're coping, when they go out to sea, plus when they're back on land, what kind of indigenous knowledge they use, the difficulties or challenges they're facing. So these are that same community that have, many have not been displaced or not have lost access to fishing grounds. So with them, trying to understand how they're adaptive, and which is, kind of different. I mean, they also facing climatic impacts, but at the same time, they have this added pressure. So here we found that, particularly we're working with the women in that community and using very creative processes like storytelling, stitching, making handicrafts, telling their stories of displacement, of their hopes and dreams and things there through that. And there we're working more on their voice and agency. So such growth is going to happen. Blue growth is. So how do we incorporate blue justice in this and look at that space? What are those dimensions of loss of identity, loss of land, loss of their livelihoods. So one example is these big mega projects are funded by a lot of World Bank, IFC, multinational companies, where they stipulate within the factory you have to have X number of women working or X, but we want to make sure it's also X number of jobs that the local people will do, including training. So that's skills training. So they said, yes, we have jobs for the local, but the locals are not trained to work in that factory. So what it is that will allow us a lot on the legal, on that side, labor rights, that side. So what I just want to highlight is, even when we talk about adaptation or, building resilience, there is different dimensions to consider, and it's very context specific, right? So we really have to have it quite ground up, but also bring in, the top-down, what kind of national laws and rights. So we use a very human rights approach. So again, we're looking at, using the small-scale fisheries, the guideline to, bring out, okay, they lost this access to fishing grounds. How do we, bring that into this dialogue on, further blue growth and blue justice issues? So these are the two kind of similar but different on how communities, and particularly we work with, mostly with the women on the Sundarban side and on the Mohashkali side, both with the fishers as well as women in the community as well. So different kind of skills training, understanding their rights, making sure they can be involved in decision making, going forward. So yeah, I haven't really kept track of the time, so I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, but maybe I'll.
You can conclude if you want to some concluding thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess the thing that bringing both of these together right now, another thing that we're trying to understand, we're lucky to be part of this this larger vulnerability to viability in small scale fisheries. So understanding these transitional processes and what are those pathways to transformation. And I think it's important, and knowledge mobilization is a big part of it. So there's much to learn about the nexus of a lot of these issues. It's so great. We heard about the legal, we heard about risk perceptions, and then, you bring in a lot of that voice of the community and their the situated adaptive coping practices that they're conducting. And, you know, the more we can have that platform, and this is a great platform in itself, you know, things like this where, you know, we can bring some of these different issues together to, you know, end of the day, it is really about us and our future generations, and you know, how we are going to live in and deal with these wicked challenges facing our society. So it's great to have that knowledge, important to have that knowledge mobilization and nexus of these issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samia. I think this is also a very topical and interesting experiences that you share with us, especially about your research. There was a question there about researchers and communities. I would like to leave that as a last question for this discussion. I would like each of you to kind of share practices about this, good practices for researchers and local communities to work together. What are the lessons learned you've had about that? But for now, I would like to ask if our audience has questions. Otherwise, I have lots of questions, but I want to leave space for people in case they have to leave at 1 sharp. If they have any question, I will look around. Raise your hand so I can moderate the discussion.
Okay, so yeah, so thanks a lot, everybody, for the contribution. I have a question for Alicia. You know, is how do you link the nature-based solution, because the Macrobiomes project is on nature-based solution, with the loss and damage? Do you see that nature-based solution can attenuate the loss and damage process, or is it too late? I mean, to do something. That's the first thing. And the second one is for Christine, is about the mitigation. And I think that's one of the very interesting facts is that when you look at the mitigation and the adaptation found, and even the, you know, the loss and damage, you find out that all the money is going to the mitigation. So you ask yourself why, you know, the people are just putting to mitigation and not to adaptation and even to loss and damage. And I think the answer is quite simple, is that the northern countries who are providing the funds are investing in the southern country to absorb the carbon. So more or less, you know, is like they are using the southern country, and the ecosystem of the southern country are carbon sink. But they are not really keen, you know, to put some money into the adaptation and even, you know, in the loss and damage. So that's why I think the legal framework is quite important, and to raise this issue at the international level, it's fundamental. Samia, I will not talk about Bangladesh. We can talk about this later. We have too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Alicia and Christine.
If I can just answer, because I have to go. Sorry, I have another meeting. So I think, yes, you're right, Pierre. You know, I don't know if it's a question or a statement, but you're right. What we're seeing is that there is a big financial gap in, you know, adaptation. The adaptation fund is not getting as much as, you know, as has been pledged for adaptation, and this has been throughout the years. And I think your observation is very true. I think the money is being diverted to mitigation, and the global north, as we say, the developed nations, you know, are using that for projects in global south countries. And, you know, and therefore they're saying, okay, so we're meeting maybe our obligations, we're giving money for mitigation projects in the global south. But I think more what is needed is what the pledge is more needed in terms of loss and damage and adaptation. And therefore this has to be taken into consideration whenever we have the COP negotiations, and, you know, this is something very important, I think. Yeah. Thanks for your observation.
And just because you have to leave, could you also give us any lessons learned about your practice in this field, and, you know, working as a researcher, as a woman researcher, but also working with local community, and then with the legal aspect, working with the government? How do you balance all those dynamics, and how do you make it work? How do you make things advance in a field that is quite challenging in the end, with a lot of political interest as well?
Right. So I think one thing that I want to say, I'm going to say two things, and maybe they're not too politically correct, but sometimes we have to be unpolitically correct. One thing is, I have been, I don't consider myself a youth anymore, have crossed the 35 years, but I have been working, since a long time. When I was a youth, within the UNFCCC, the Young Group. And, we have been really pushing for the voices of, youth from the global south, for them to have a voice, for them to have a seat at the table. And what I've seen, in terms of my experience is, all of us, we have been speaking about, all of the speakers have been speaking about, local knowledge, that we have to use local knowledge. And unfortunately, even if youth are having a voice, I think the voice tends to come from the global north, and the voice tends to come from people that don't really know what are happening in global south communities, in what is actually happening in the trenches. So I think one thing is that we have to really give importance to youth knowledge, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and the global north young people, the global north scientists, practitioners. They have a lot of goodwill. But of course, they have a lot of goodwill. They want to help, global north countries, etc. But I think, and I'm going to stress it, that we need to have this indigenous and this local knowledge taken care of, because if we don't understand what is happening in the trenches, we don't, make a needs analysis of what these people really need, in the local communities, and use their knowledge, which is already giving, results, then we're going to miss out on a lot of things. And I think the second thing that I'm going to say, as an academic, I find it in Mauritius, and also, when I speak with my colleagues in the SIDS, it's very difficult to work, transdisciplinarily, like we're doing right now. It's very difficult to, really find people who want to, attack the problem of climate change from a transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary lens. That's a roadblock. That's a challenge that I've had in my own work, because I find myself very, very lonely sometimes when, I'm writing papers and, trying to find solutions to, the climate change or the loss and damage issue. So that's one thing. And, it's very difficult also to work with other stakeholders. So I would really, that's kind of a challenge that I've been through, working with other stakeholders, with the government, with the civil society, because each, civil society works on its own, the government works on its own, policymakers are there, then, academics are there, but we have to bring everyone together. So I think that's the kind of challenge that, I've been seeing in my work since I've started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that will resonate to many of us. And I think if we have a little bit of time, so if some people can share their experience, that would be great as well. Thank you very much for your time, Krishna. If you have to leave, you are free to do so. And thank you very much for all your input. And now I will give the floor to Alicia.
Yes, no, thank you, Claire, for your question. I think NBS can be a way if it works well, but I will say it will depend if we do NBS also. I mean, if other things going on, so we around where we are doing SBS are also aligned with it, so that we don't do, for instance, mitigation actions that will actually have detrimental impact on biodiversity. So I will say it depends also of what is going on around, and what we understand, how NBS is understood in context, and also how it's correlated with local knowledge, because we also have a lot of promises, I think, with, for instance, agroecology and other key concepts like that, and often the results haven't delivered. So I think we can also learn from maybe other area on how to ensure that NBS can be a solution. But I think the biggest challenge will be really if other initiatives are taking place in the same space and actually will undermine nature-based solutions. So that would be my perspective on it, but it can be a solution if we, if you will call it beyond NBS. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point to make. And now there is quite a lot of funding going towards NBS, and I think it's important to not miss the train, but at the same time to ensure that things that are already in place are not forgotten. And it's often this question of innovation, innovative research, etc. I think one question I will have before we wrap up is maybe one example of one positive example or a successful example of you in your research that you've seen that this integration of local perspective have led to something tangible of some sort, either policy change or even an action from an NGO. I wonder if you could share in a few words if you have something like that that you have seen, or if you could share a story of a potential of something that could lead to a better co-production of knowledge and integration of different perspective in climate change adaptation and mitigation. I will start with Samia and then Tanya, and then we look back to Alicia again. Yeah.
So thank you. So like an example of something positive. I mean, there are several, but I guess the one that comes to mind is so working with the displaced communities due to blue growth in the Moshkali area, because we started working with the women, and it was part of my postdoc, which was looking at marine conflicts. So it's started to understand the conflict, but because of the way the project was set out, where, as I mentioned before, it was really important to first build rapport with the community. And yes, we knew about the history of the conflict, and like the activities were known, but understanding what it is, how they want to resolve it. And it wasn't so much about let's stop the growth and all the blue growth development, but really find those pathways where they can be part of it. Not necessarily like they want to move away from fishing and all joint factories, but to find a more equitable ways for it to be addressed. So the action that happened from that is that, because we had the exhibition of their stories in Dhaka, because it was more than just an academic grant, they allowed, and then Japan picked it up from different, just really for internet. And then this company in Australia wanted us to showcase to the actual funders, right, who funded that Motherberry project. So then we took that exhibition to Japan, and then they had a lot of activists group there, also saying, stop fossil fuel, stop protest, like don't fund these things. And I'm sure it wasn't just like our one exhibition that made it happen. Obviously, a lot of lobbying had been happening, but it did result in the next phase of that coal plant from being made stop for now. And hopefully that time to really start looking into, these issues I mentioned on, what kind of, looking back at the environmental impact assessments, looking at, how the fishermen are being impacted due to loss of fishing grounds. So that time to really start finding that middle ground, where you can still meet both the needs. So that was, one example of how, at least in our work, that's happening.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. I think it's good also, as you mentioned, or Krishna mentioned, this platform that we have now is really to share ideas, and we get the kind of contacts with each other to know who works on what, and then maybe also share practices amongst the participants. So Tanya, could you also share one example from your field with local fishers on something that has been successful, led to some kind of co-production of something good?
So in my study area, I think the one practical thing that came out of this, because we had the National Meteorological Agency present in the workshop that we had, and we left there having designed a new way of communicating early warning system to the local communities, because there is an early warning system already in South Africa by the Meteorological Agency, but the local people complained that it's in English, in the language that they don't understand, and it's disseminated in TV or or in the internet or in the radio. And because they're in the remote areas, they don't have access to TVs because maybe 2 or 3 houses have electricity, but they all have at least their cell phones. And by the time the information is being disseminated in the news or in the TV, they're usually not there. They're not home. They're out at sea. So they need information right there. So then we left there having made that agreement that now the fishermen are going to receive in fact those because I worked with 7 communities, but we all came together in one community. So all the fishing communities along the east coast of South Africa, the wild coast of South Africa, are now receiving their early warning system in isiXhosa, which is their local language, and they are getting it via SMS in their phones. But what has been difficult is to deliver that early warning system in impact-based instead of hazard-based, because the South African Weather Service, when they issue out the early warning system, they talk about millimeters of rainfall and speed of wind. And to the fishermen, that is not meaningful. They need to know impact. So they want an impact-based early warning system. And that's something that now the meteorological the South African Weather Service is looking at in terms of how can they do that for those people, because they haven't done it before and they don't know how to do it. But at least now they're getting what everyone is getting in the form and in the language that they want it in.
Excellent. That's a good example. Thank you. I think from like conflict management to change of communication ways, that's quite good for us to understand as well. Alicia, do you have something to share with us? Maybe something that you've seen in your research as well?
I guess it will be more maybe the method, because I'm still analyzing the result and so on at the stage of my thesis. But I think it was quite appreciated by the fisher locally that we actually have asked questions other than catches, which are what they are usually asked. So they were really appreciating of questions that were more related to the knowledge, how things, the tradition in Martinique, for instance, regarding fisheries. And this was quite appreciated. And the way also haven't done it is more like a grounded way, if I can say, where I arrived and I didn't have really a set of questions, but more like a general discussion on how the day is going, etc. So I noticed it have helped to decrease the tension between maybe science versus local expertise, for instance. So I think the way we approach the field is it's quite important actually, yes, to do research and to put confidence in people to give time to us.
I think that's a very nice point to make about giving space and also considering not just to be takers as researchers in the field is quite important. And I think that's also a very nice point to end this discussion. We're already like outside the time, so it was very good to hear from you all. Thank you very much for our audience as well. I would like to raise another seminar that will happen in about a month about gender dynamics in ocean sailing. And also you can keep up with the newsletter of the CBG if you want to know what's going on. It seems there's been a lot of things going on lately, so it's all very interesting. So thank you all, and I hope this has given you all the opportunity to think about different aspects of climate change and local communities within coastal areas and also fisheries. But also you have now the contact of these amazing speakers that work in different fields from different disciplinary and also perspectives. So it's up to you to make things rolling and going and have this conversation going. We will be in touch. Pierre will be in touch with the speakers for something interesting. Okay, so thank you very much all. Thank you for your time, and I will see you again in another seminar. Thank you. Bye-bye.